this chapter, we're going to see how shutter speed affects objects in motion. So buckle in and hang on. Shutter speed definitely affects exposure, but it also affects anything that's moving or camera motion itself. Let's take a look at some examples of moving objects. In this first example, I've set the camera up on a tripod to capture the car moving past the camera at various shutter speeds. Let's see how changing the shutter speed can make the image go from this to this. In this first image, I'm using a shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second. The car is actually traveling at 40 miles an hour, but because the shutter speed is so fast, the motion is actually being frozen. In the next images, I'll be using progressively slower shutter speeds. Here's 1/500th of a second, 50% slower than 1/1000th. The car's still traveling at the same speed, but because the shutter is so fast, motion is still being frozen. At 2/50th of a second, we start to notice the car getting a little blurry, especially the wheels. At 1/25th of a second, the car is visibly blurry, and now we're starting to get motion smear from left to right. At 1/60th of a second, this motion smear becomes even more evident. And as the shutter speeds keep slowing down, more motion blur becomes apparent. Here's 1/8 of a second, and finally at 1/4 or 1/4 of a second, the car has so much motion it's just an unrecognizable blur. That was just one example of how any shutter speed affects relative motion. Let's see some other examples of how shutter speed can dramatically affect an image. Here's a ride at a local fair taken at 1/5 of a second while the ride was stopped. Let's keep the same shutter speed and wait to see what happens as the ride starts to move. In this image, it's obvious the ride has started to swing. And in each successive image, the ride moves faster and faster to the point where at full speed, the ride has made a complete circle in 1/5 of a second. Purposely using a slow shutter speed allowed us to transform a static object into a spinning wheel of color. Here's a typical water park fountain taken with a 1/2000th of a second shutter. The exposure was so fast that it was able to freeze every water droplet in place, making it appear motionless. But if I were to then slow down the shutter to 1/15th of a second, then these motionless water droplets are transformed into smooth arcs. The choice of whether to use a fast or slow shutter speed comes down to personal preference and whether or not you need motion to be frozen in time or if you want to create a smooth, more flowing appearance. But there are yet other ways that you can use shutter speed. Previously, I kept the camera still and used a fast shutter speed to freeze the motion of the subject. However, in this picture, I'm doing almost the opposite. I'm using a very slow shutter speed of 1/15th of a second, and I am moving the camera to follow the subject, allowing the background to be blurred. This technique is called panning, and it allows you to keep your subject sharp while still creating a sense of motion. In this panning shot, I used an even slower shutter speed, which gave the subject a little bit of a blur and giving the overall image an exaggerated sense of speed. Understanding shutter speed will allow you to control the motion of your subject, prevent camera shake during low light situations, and produce stunning effects with time-lapse photography. All of this and more is accomplished by the simple turn of a dial.